Good morning. I'm Dr. Steve Stites, Chief Medical Officer here at the University of Kansas Health System. Welcome back to Open Mics with Dr. Stites. You may have seen headlines about ongoing shortages of several different chemotherapy drugs, among others. The most critical in shortages, though, include two low-cost generic drugs that are used frequently in chemotherapy regimen, cisplatin and carboplatin. Drug shortages, even cancer drug shortages, are not new. But they present challenges for physicians, pharmacists, and patients. And today, we're going to hear about how the health system is handling those shortages and talk about what it means nationally as well as locally. We're going to talk about what we can do to help prevent those problems. Here with me today is Dr. Jeff Holzberlein, Physician-in-Chief at the University of Kansas Cancer Center, one of our urologic oncologic surgeons. A lot of words there. Rick Coldry is the Health Systems Vice President of Pharmacy and Health Professions. Thank you both for being here. I'm looking forward to this discussion. The New York Times ran this big article over the weekend talking about drug shortages and specifically referencing the two drugs we just mentioned, cisplatin and carboplatin, with the idea that there are cancer patients who are getting denied these therapies because they can't be found. Now, Dr. Holzberlein, I know you have surgery scheduled for this morning. We're going to talk to you first, get you out of here, but tell us a little bit about cisplatin and carboplatin and how are they being used?
So cisplatin and carboplatin really are two of the most important drugs that we use for chemotherapy for treating cancer patients. They really form the backbone of a lot of the regimens that we use to treat a variety of malignancies. The chief ones that we treat, of course, with that would be testicular cancer, bladder cancer, lung cancer, and ovarian cancer. And in those situations, there's really not a very good alternative for those drugs. The shortage, as you mentioned, is not new. We've been dealing with chemotherapy drug shortages now for really over the last decade. And the problem is pretty complex, and it has to do with a variety of factors, but chief of that is that many of those drugs are no longer made in the United States. So what's caused this current shortage is that the major supplier of these two drugs, a company called Intas in India, has some very serious issues relating quality of their manufacturing. And of course, everybody knows how critical it is to be safe when you're manufacturing these drugs. You just absolutely cannot afford any impurities or any mistakes. And so when the FDA reviewed this plant, they found a number of significant concerns, and the plant was closed. And that has resulted in the current shortage of these two medications.
Yeah, and so that's a big deal. We're going to talk a little bit more with Rick Coldry in a little bit from the pharmaceutical end of that. But how's our supply right now here at KU?
So fortunately, we really have not had to switch to alternative regimens. We have been able to provide chemotherapy, these two drugs, for all of our patients. So we're not changing any regimens. We're not rationing. We have been able to have adequate supplies to date and keep up with the demand that we have. So we're managing that well, and that really is because we have an outstanding pharmacy team that really monitors the situation closely.
So nice to him. Good Lord. All right, my stomach turned flops there. So, all right, so we're not seeing the shortage, and again, we'll talk to Rick in a minute. I know you have to go, but if you did, what would you do with this kind of patients? I mean, if there was a problem and you said to say to a patient, well, what do you say? Sir, we don't have the drug that we need, or ma'am, to treat your cancer.
So, fortunately, the American Society for Clinical Oncology has come out with some recommendations when it's appropriate to switch to alternative regimens. Those regimens, in most instances, demonstrate the similar efficacy, but they may have different toxicity. And so, again, if there's any concern about that, visit with your physician and discuss this with them. In some instances, there are some alternative regimens.
Yeah, I think that those regimens are important, and hopefully we'll be able to keep those drugs in good supply. Now, I know you have to go to the operating room, but before you do, we wanted to get your reaction to some big news yesterday. Cancer Center is going to develop a brand new building, and it's not just any kind of a building. This is a special place because we're going to be able to combine basic research and clinical care together in a really large cancer center right here on the campus, right by the cancer hospital. So let's take a look.
The Sunderland Foundation is committing to assist the construction of the new building with a grant in the amount of $100 million.
Okay. Dude, $100 million, that's approximately a lot of money, and I think it's one of the biggest donations in the history of the state of Kansas. What do you think about that?
I mean, what a phenomenal day, right? Yeah. And, the amount of generosity, not just from the Sunderland family, but really from all of Kansas City, Senator Moran securing the $43 million from the federal government to help with this building. It has to be one of the highlights of my career here at the University of Kansas.
Well, I think it is, because it's a big deal. This cancer research clinical care building all in one place. You know, when you look at it and you say, man, if we put the research people right by the clinical people and they're all talking about how to solve problems and how to develop new solutions, what a great opportunity for people to do some of the best care we can do and go right from the bench, that is the lab bench, all the way to the bedside, right in the same spot. That's pretty special. So this $43 million in federal funding that you mentioned from with the help of Senator Moran, $100 million gift from the Sunderland Foundation. Big darn deal, single gift ever received by the University of Kansas, and construction is going to hopefully start with the groundbreaking this coming fall. So I understand that you do have to go. Don't walk away with your microphone on.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you for being here. All right. Rick Coldry, we're going to talk to you for a minute.
Sir.
So Rick, as I understand this whole drug shortage thing, it's kind of a result of when drugs go from being retail or owned by a certain, you know, the pharmaceutical who's helped develop the drug, they get to put their brand on it. It's real, they can charge a lot of money. But then it goes generic after 7 years or some such thing.
Yeah.
And then other makers start doing it. The price falls. That's a good thing. But when there gets to be a lot of competitors out there and the price continues to fall, it's hard to make that drug in the U.S. and still maintain a profit. So they go overseas to be made, and then we don't have as much quality control. How did I do?
Really good.
It's like I've been practicing medicine for 33 years, or maybe 34, maybe longer than that, actually.
And this might not be the first time we've had this conversation.
No, it may not be.
Unfortunately, about drug shortages. But yeah, no, you pretty much nailed it. It's very difficult for drug manufacturers to make a profit on generic drugs with low cost. It's a very low margin industry. The U.S. isn't the least expensive country in the world to produce things, and so then, for lack of a better term, a lot of generic manufacturing of drugs gets offshored to other countries. A couple things I'll throw out there in addition to quality risk. You might remember a couple years ago a large hurricane hit
Puerto Rico. Yeah, I remember that. That was not good.
Which crazily, like 80% of the world's manufacturing of water and saline to inject into patients is made in Puerto Rico. And so then we had shortage of salt water. It was sterile product to hydrate patients, and no one could understand why. But it's a long-term problem. It's a global issue, not just affecting the U.S., but it's not going away. It hasn't gone away.
So it's interesting that the Food and Drug Administration can do inspections at a plant in India. How has that happened? Talk to me about that.
Well, this plant that Dr. Holzberlein was talking about with Entos, they supply about half of the cisplatin for the U.S. So if any company desires to import drugs into the U.S., they have to be inspected. So the FDA has purview over what
inspect those drugs, and thank goodness they do, because it makes sure the manufacturing is safe and they can find those irregularities and take care of it. But it can really affect this, and so really, kind of, the drugs are real expensive. It would probably be being manufactured by a U.S. pharmaceutical here in this country.
That's right.
But if not, they're going to be manufactured in a place where there's a lower cost environment. That's right. And the FDA still tries to go over there. So what other solutions do we have for solving this? Because it doesn't only apply to cisplatin and carboplatin.
That's right. There's a number of governmental entities and institutes that are trying to study this problem. And the fix, unfortunately, it isn't easy, because in order to incent companies to make these really cheap but really vital things, they need to have enough of a margin that they can reinvest in their plant. We've lost generic manufacturers because the cost to upgrade their plant after 15 or 20 years was so high that they couldn't afford to do it, and so they just pull out of the market. So the leading suggestion on how we fix this in the U.S. and the world is we pay more somewhere for generic drug manufacturing.
Yeah, that's a tough solution, because drugs have gone up so much, and we can talk for just a minute. It's not so much a drug shortage as it is where we are in the world right now and where we are in the story of medicine. But there's this kind of coming revolution about what's going to happen in healthcare in the next 10 to 15 years with these new biologics, meaning kind of partly man-made, partly human. I mean, they're trying to mimic parts of the body that are supposed to be able to control cancer or fight asthma, et cetera. Those drugs that are coming out, they're crazy high in cost.
That's right.
Talk to us a little bit about some of what you're seeing.
Okay. Well, you know, I'm sure we've talked, you've talked, I don't know if I've been here, but we talked about CAR T products, right?
That's an amazing therapy for cancer patients.
Amazing therapy. You know, evidence suggests it's curative in some cases, but then the cost of those products is $400,000, $500,000 per individual treatment.
That's a lot.
That's a lot, yeah.
So there's so the drug that we use a lot in the cystic fibrosis world is called Trikafta. It's actually a combination of 3 medicines, $300,000 every year.
Ongoing.
And these people now the kids are getting it at 2 years old. They have to be on it for and now they look like they could have a very normal life expectancy, which is amazing if you've been practicing CF. I mean, when I started in cystic fibrosis, people lived to be about 16 or 17, and now I'm talking to patients I'm saying, look, you better start saving for retirement because you no longer can spend every dime you have thinking you're not going to live past tomorrow, because you're going to live a lot of tomorrows.
Right.
And that's an amazing thing to say to a patient, but $300,000 a year is expensive.
Yep. I mean that's the double-edged sword. We've in pharmacy manufacturers and science has developed incredible cures or not even cures, but treatments for diseases and terrible conditions for people. And currently the cost for those is just incredibly high. The one always that kind of, I remember, sort of started this curve was Hep C treatments.
Oh yeah, that was I do. Hep C kind of sounds like they wanted to charge how much?
$25,000, but then you're cured.
Yeah.
It's gone.
It's not gone. You have to be on some therapy lifelong, potentially. And the CF drugs actually, they help set a new curve too, because those first oral therapy you just walked around and took at $300,000 a year.
That's right.
But you know, it was a small population of patients. The drug company said, well, I want to take the money back, or re-earn the money so I can reinvest it in more research and development. Yet pharmaceuticals average margins around 18 to 40%, so it's not like they don't have a good margin.
That's right.
But one of our challenges is that then when drugs do get cheaper, they are manufactured in a generic way, and they go overseas, A, quality control, B, supply and demand.
Supply, yeah. And an interesting thing that I learned about generic drugs again is 15%, 15 of our low-cost generic drugs have one single manufacturer.
Wow. Wow.
15%, right?
That's a lot, right?
Yeah,
and we see it with these drugs, and people are at risk. And even though our supply has been okay, we've not had to stop therapy for anybody or not give people what they needed. There are reports, and the New York Times detailed that in their article. Here are these patients who didn't get their therapy.
Yep.
And although a lot of those folks in the article were at risk but had still gotten it. And so we know it's a real shortage. We know it's a concern. There are people who are being denied. That's a really bad outcome. And also thinking about it, we saw that with some cardiac drugs. Dobutamine was in short supply.
That's right.
We saw it in drugs we use to diagnose patients with disease under a CAT scan, known as a contrast agent.
That's right.
So I want to blame all this on the pandemic. It's somehow related to the pandemic? I want to blame COVID.
You know, sure. We can blame COVID. No question the pandemic made anything related to supply chain worse. I think we can say that without question. So we have a critical issue, at-risk manufacturing for generic drugs, and then the pandemic put on top of it. It definitely heightened it. We're at an all-time high. There's a great University of Utah Drug Information Center has been tracking our drug shortages for decades. They kind of made a business out of it, and they're currently saying they're all-time high 301 drugs that are on shortage. You know,
that's a lot of drugs that are on shortage, and hopefully we're not seeing patients have struggled because of that. And again, we know that, and Dr. Holzbein mentioned the types like testicular cancer, ovarian cancer, lung cancer, where cisplatin and carboplatin are really the basis of therapy. And so if you don't have that, you could really change your outcome.
That's right.
And you know, we're fortunate we've not had to deny it, but we know that that's always a concern when things get in short supply, and there are some reports of patients having it happen. All right, so we talked a little bit about how we want to blame COVID. I think a lot of it is, you know, labor costs have gone up, things are in short supply. It does make manufacturing a little more difficult. I wonder if people feel like I got to start cutting some corners, and pretty soon they get into trouble.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's a logical conclusion.
All right. Well, thank you, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. We're here to answer some of your questions, though. Send them on to us using the links on your screen from YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or email the Medical News Network. We're going to take a look now at our COVID count. Doc Hawk is out doing some work today. Actually, I think he's having to do some inpatient care of sick folks. Today, we have 13 total inpatients. 6 have active infections. 2 patients are in the ICU. None are on ventilators right now. So if you look at our numbers, you know, we got down below 10 for our total count. That was awesome. We kind of snuck up over the weekend to 17, today 13, a few more in the ICU. This is just where I think it's going to run. I think we're welcome to the new reality. I think this could go on for years like this. And I think the problem will be the surges, and our challenge will be it's going to be kind of an all-year disease, but the more severe parts will occur in the fall and the winter. When people go back inside, they haven't had an infection in a while, they haven't necessarily been vaccinated, and then they start spreading a new variant. I think that's going to be the challenge. I think we'll see that pattern play out. But in the meantime, the more you do outside, the safer you'll always be. All right. Do we have questions today? We're going to find out from our good friend Alexis Delcy.
Good morning. We're going to start with Pauline, and Pauline would like to know, in a shortage, does being a larger hospital or health system, like the University of Kansas Health System, does that help?
Wow, does it help us or hurt us? Rick Colton.
100% it helps us. The other thing that I would say that helps us in this particular instance with cancer drug shortages is that we are a comprehensive NCI designated cancer center. So they know that we have a broad reach. We can get to a lot of patients, and also when you're a large purchaser, the tendency is to try to satisfy what you've been historically purchasing. So
right.
Then you can make it through a little bit easier because you have a little bit more of a buffer when you're used to buying a lot of a product.
Yen Liang has a question, and we touched on this. You touched on this a bit. Yen would like to know what you think is the major cause for the shortage of cancer drugs in the U.S.
Well, it's not all cancer drugs. It's really just those that are generic drugs. And I think that's what we've outlined today. When they're made overseas,
that's right.
Okay.
I do think the supply chain issues have hurt across the world.
That's right.
Because, you know, on something like this, it's usually, well, it can be one factor. A hurricane wipes out all manufacturing for saline out in Puerto Rico, or 80% of it. But that's the question of, well, why don't we have more than one point manufacturing it? And the answer is, it is costly to manufacture drugs because of the level of quality control you need to have, the sterile environment. You got to be in the monkey suits. You know, you got to. I mean, you can't have bacteria in the medicines that you're going to give people intravenously or impurities like some of the pills you take, and so as a result you have to be really good about manufacturing standards. And it's like, gosh, if you knew it was always going to pull to the right because they didn't line the steering up and you're going to go into a ditch, you wouldn't want to have that car, right? Well, that's because they did something wrong with manufacturing. In this case, what it is, it's not a car, it's the drugs you're going to take, and you don't want those to be manufactured inappropriately.
Yeah.
So, but Rick, it's hard to maintain those necessarily really pure conditions. Talk to us a little bit about the steps that these pharmaceuticals have to take when they make a drug to make sure it stays safe.
Yeah, no problem. Actually, I was fortunate enough a couple of years ago to actually tour a sterile production facility in Michigan. And it would be great if people could see what it does take. It's incredible. So it's like entering a different world. Inside these manufacturing facilities, it's typically all stainless steel and bright white. You go in through a room, you have to change into a completely covered suit. You have to wear a face mask to even enter the actual production facility. And then you have to clean after you go in the perfectly clean suit. And that's the conditions that the folks have to work in on the inside when they're manufacturing these products, because as you said, they have to be sterile, because anything you're going to put into someone's bloodstream directly, you cannot have any impurities or anything that might infect or cause harm to them. That's an incredibly difficult situation to have exist in general, and then when you're trying to do it on a massive scale, like you're creating thousands and thousands of vials of product per hour, it's just very expensive to maintain that.
Have a great question that came in from one of our viewers, Jean Schlotzhauer. She says she was told by 2 doctors that generic Synthroid is not the same as the name brand and doesn't work for some people. So she would like to know, are there other drugs where the generic drug doesn't work as well?
Yeah, that is a great question, because I swear to God, I like to buy brand name naproxen over generic. What do you think?
So here, I'm going to be a pharmacist for you.
You go right ahead. You are a pharmacist.
I am, I know.
You don't have to be one. I'm going to pretend to play one on TV.
I'll play one on TV with you this morning. So anything that is equivalently rated is been tested to be equivalently effective as a generic product.
So tell us what that means. What's equivalent rated means?
So what that means is the FDA, again, these generic manufacturers have to go in and demonstrate to the FDA that the product that they're making, it works as well as the brand name products. So there's a whole ratings situation. It's A-rated. That means that they're equivalent. They should work equivalently the same. Now, I say that as a pharmacist, and I think that is true and accurate. And everybody's body and physiology is a little bit different. You know, your naproxen could be that the way that those tablets are made, they disintegrate when you take them in your stomach a little bit quicker, a little bit easier. You absorb them a little bit faster. So, you know, maybe it does work a little bit better for you.
Or maybe one of the other things that are used to hold these drugs together may be different, and that may be not tolerating that as well.
Right.
Because here, you know, it's kind of like if Captain Kirk calls down to Scotty and says, "Scotty, I need more warp drive," and Scotty says, "I got a generic warp engine, and the warp part just failed, Captain." It'd be like, "Oh, how does that happen? Then the Star Trek, then the Enterprise can't go anywhere."
That's right.
That would be bad, and I think we know we have to be thoughtful about how we do it. But if everything's really the same, I get it, and yet I think your point's well taken that it may not be the actual drug, it may be other ways and how that drug's affected. So I have to take a little potassium chloride. I swear to God, it dissolves in my mouth every time I take it. It's the generic version. I want to get the manufactured pill of potassium chloride. You can't find a drug product, potassium chloride, anymore, and so you have to get these generics, and it freaking dissolves in the back of my throat every single time.
I'm the same with you, not with that, but my allergy medicine.
Yeah.
I want generic to work so much better than regular. I want it to work the same.
It's half the price.
Exactly. It does not work.
Yeah.
It's so disappointing. It works, but doesn't have the oomph that my brand name has.
And isn't it also true, Rick Coulter, that the generic, how do you like, now you're on the witness stand.
Let's go.
Now you're on the stand. I'm coming after you, buddy. Here it comes.
Plead the fifth.
Yeah, so, yeah, there you go. But the manufacturing standards are a little wider for generic than they are for the original drug when it's manufactured. Like if I say the dose of cumin on this drug is 2 milligrams, for the product, it's got to be 2, but for generic, can it be like 1.9 to 2.1 or something like that? Because that's what you hear out on the street.
Again, a long time ago, I worked
in a plant.
In a plant, and
you were the problem.
I screwed things up constantly.
Yeah,
so it's a big mess. So
yeah,
no, not true.
You're responsible for my warp engines, not cool.
Part of what I worked on, and this is kind of a low level, but I worked on making generic calcium tablets.
Okay.
And my experience was they're pretty exacting.
They still are.
They're pretty exacting.
You have confidence as long as the supplier is good. All right. Back to Alexis.
I have a COVID question from Jean. Jean wants to know, what do you have to say about the new South Dakota variant?
You know, there are variants coming out everywhere all the time, and what you have to do is just wait and see how that really affects folks across the country and what happens with it. Because there are generics, as I said, we've seen it, right? You know, we've got the original strain, the alpha strain, the delta strain, the gamma strain, the lambda strain. We've had so many different strains, Omicron, and now we got all the different forms of Omicron, and now we're in the XBB thing, which I swear to God sounds like an Xbox game or a starfighter on Star Wars. It's the XBB Star Wars fighter, but in reality, all these are fortunately preserving enough of the spike protein region that we hope that they're not very immunoevasive. And our concern about the XBB 1.16, I think, and some of the other new variants is that if they do become a little more immunoevasive, meaning they evade our immune systems a little easier, then what happens is the vaccine or prior infection isn't as protective. I think there's a little nervousness about that this coming fall. I think we're going to see a new vaccination for that that will hopefully be out in September. One of the good things about the mRNA technology is our ability to pivot so fast. But in terms of the South Dakota variant, keep an eye on it. We'll see how that plays against what's predicted to be the XBB variant as being the big challenge this fall.
Sharon has a question. This is a great question. It's about expiration dates on medication.
Oh,
She
that
wants
is
to
a
know.
great question.
And there's a lot of questions about this, but her question specifically is, do those drugs have an expiration date if they're the ones that are overproduced?
Overproduced, I'm going
Like
to guess they mean in
cheap-
generic and things like that.
Probably.
And so, yeah. So, but they all have expiration dates.
All
but
have expiration dates.
are the expiration, because you go to the meat counters and they have an expiration date or food, and there's some stuff out there, yeah, how reliable are expiration dates? But in the world of drug manufacturing, how reliable are expiration dates?
So here's a short version on this. Part of what the drug companies have to do on their product is demonstrate how long their drug stays viable, how long it stays at the level of effectiveness. So is it 100%? And then how much time does it take for them to start to decay? And many times these studies are done based on, okay, we'll look 2 years later and it's still 100%, but like, 2 years is long enough. We know it's good, so we're going to put a 2-year expiration date on it. So there are, in many cases, not specific studies. Well, how long, what is the true shelf life of this drug? Like, we don't monitor it for 10 or 15 or 20 years to see if it's still good later.
It's kind of most of it's 2 years.
Right, so most of it's 2 years.
And
That's right.
interestingly, I may have taken a little naproxen that was 4 or 5 years, and I think it still worked. I don't know that I can recommend that.
Wouldn't necessarily
So do you
recommend
throw
that,
all
but-
drugs out at your house once the expiration dates hit?
My wife absolutely does.
Excellent, I'm impressed.
I do not, though.
Yeah, I may not be that good. Go ahead, Alexis.
Got a text from someone named Jane who wants to know if antibiotics are the only drug that become dangerous once they expire. Like, I think she's saying, you had mentioned that they get less effective.
That's right.
And I remember hearing somewhere in over the years that don't ever take expired antibiotics.
Yeah.
So I think that's what she's referring to.
Yeah, I can't say that I know of any medication off the top of my head, so I could be easily proven wrong.
And the top of the head has no protection if you have no hair.
So you know who knows what's
You're
coming.
really right there.
But that are actually dangerous after expiration date. So I'm not sure. I can't verify that. But on the expired antibiotics, there's a risk that they become less effective, and you never want to reduce the efficacy of your antibiotics ever. And the other thing, and so here again, I'm going to be a pharmacist for everyone again. So when you get your antibiotics, even though you maybe feel better in a day or two, finish the whole course. Don't take part of it and stop. So take it all and take it, and don't take expired antibiotics. Yes.
Well, and I think the other part of the challenge would be, let's say your antibiotic has started to deteriorate, it's expired. Now it's 80% as effective. Will you still get the right treatment response?
That's right.
I think that's one of the challenges we face.
That is it.
Because if you don't have the same treatment response, then maybe you're not going to do as well, and then you may even have some bacteria left behind. Then you may find that you have a little resistance to develop, and that's antibiotics. I think it's important to recognize. I mean, I really do. I actually do try to throw out most of the drugs once they're expired, unless I injure myself trying to work out or do something stupid again, and then I may take expired naproxen. Go ahead, Alex.
The Whitakers have written in, a couple. The Whitakers, thank you for watching. They write, I need a brand name Mestinone. Generic doesn't work for me. Not sure if you guys can give brand name recommendations, but I need a brand name Mestinone. Generic doesn't work for me. My family saw the difference when they switched to generic in my pill box. I'd taken Mestinone for myasthenia gravis 30 plus years. Oh, so she's sharing. She's not asking you for a good brand name Mestinone.
Yeah.
So she's sharing same thing for her Mestinone. Doesn't work. Am I saying that right, Mestinone?
Close enough.
Okay, close enough. Well, that's all right.
You've not made a mess out of it anyway.
So she's sharing that. And then someone else wrote down that they can relate to the generic Synthroid, that the same thing happens to them. It doesn't work as well as
It's funny, I hear a lot about that with Synthroid. The generic
Okay.
doesn't. I don't know what the deal is, but man, you hear that from patients all the time, and they want to be back on the product.
Well, actually, and I recognize that product as a treatment for myasthenia gravis. And back to your levothyroxine. So myasthenia gravis is a really difficult disease to treat and very sensitive to therapy. So those things we were talking
and
about.
very sensitive to the actual dose of therapy.
Right.
As a Synthroid. Very
yes,
sensitive to the dose of therapy.
That's the point I was going to make. Is and again on Synthroid, the dose is really small. So if you're off by just a little bit, it can have a significant effect. Anytime you're giving or taking something where there's a high sensitivity, the hormones like levothyroxine, and they can regulate your body, it can make a big difference.
So, I do a lot of lung transplant follow-up. We work closely with Barnes Hospital for that stuff, and we're following tacrolimus or Prograf levels all the time. And what happens is that your insurance companies try to make sure that they're paying the lowest possible price for drug therapy that they have to when you're covered, but your drug therapies are covered by insurance. So they'll say, we want you to get the product from XYZ, and it's got to be one of these types of the drug, the generic manufacturer. So your insurance companies will actually often control what type of manufacturer is giving you the medication. And they'll change. They may change halfway through the year, they may change once a year. And so the manufacturer, there are 3 or 4 manufacturers of Prograf out there, and every time they switch the type or the brand of Prograf that you're taking, we have to refigure out the dosing because people's doses aren't the same on 2 different manufacturers of the same drug. It may say 1 milligram or 2 milligrams on the capsule, but what we know is that that dose may not be the same that somebody needs because they just changed drug manufacturers.
Or maybe their body doesn't absorb it the same way.
Exactly, exactly. I think that's the deal. I think they're not absorbing it. Again, it melts in your mouth, not in your hand, but it may not be doing it the right spot, and then you can't get it absorbed. It does. I think your point about, man, if it starts to break down your esophagus and not your stomach, then you don't deliver as much to the intestine. There's so many things that go into how drugs are delivered.
Yep, that's right.
Angela has a personal question for Dr. Stites. Well, it's not too personal.
Yeah, you go right ahead. Bring it on.
She wants to know, Dr. Stites, have you had the new vaccine, second booster?
I have. I've had 2 bivalent vaccination boosters. Did great. I think it's was the right thing to do for me. But then I'm of that age, and I have a couple of chronic health problems. So it's like, you know what? Go get the second booster. And this fall, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get the new monovalent vaccine directed against Omicron XBB.
You know, walk in and say, do me.
You'll be right. You'll see me do it right here.
Will you roll up your sleeves?
Well, I'm going to bring my tidy-whitey tank top right back so everybody can see it again.
That's what the people
I hear that was a real thrill of the world. Or not.
People have been demanding more of that.
Probably not, but go ahead.
Jean has a question. Jean wants to know, a great question, why are drug costs in the U.S. so much higher than in other countries?
Ooh, that's a great question.
That is
let's talk about that.
That is a complicated question. The short version in my as far as I know, is many other governments regulate drug prices.
Yes.
That's one of the biggest things.
And other governments, not only do they regulate, they bargain drug prices.
That's right.
And there's been legislation that prevented Medicare from doing that in the United States. Medicare is by far the single largest purchaser of drugs. It's never been able to bargain. They had to accept the market rate.
So that's why you hear about your grandparents getting their medications from Canada, things like that in the mail.
And so what we've tried to do, and what I think I don't know which way this will turn, the manufacturers say, look, we need this high revenue in order to make sure we develop new drugs. Because the fact is, like it or not, the United States is the single, by far, largest contributor of new drug therapy in the world.
That's correct.
And what happens is when we buy drugs, we are to some degree underwriting the cost of that for the entire world. And that's why you can go get the same drug so much cheaper in other countries. And it does drive me a little crazy though, because I think we would still see new drug development and we could see lower drug prices. Health insurance wouldn't cost so much and we wouldn't be paying so much. And I would be okay with taking that risk. I think there'll still be plenty of manufacturing. Here's another trick. Comment on this.
Yeah.
Many of the drugs we take that are new drugs are not actually developed by pharmaceuticals. They're developed in research labs in places like the University of Kansas or in other academic health centers across the country. Then they may be picked up by a startup company, and then the large manufacturers pick up those startup companies so they can have and control the drug.
That's right.
And so then what they're doing is they're paying for the research trials much more than they're paying for the actual development of the drug. That occurred often from grants funded through the NIH.
That's right.
Talk to us about that. Am I correct in my little dissertation there?
No, it's a very complicated world, but yes, I agree with you. In science research labs and universities, that's part of what we do. That's why we're here, right, as academic medicine. And it is that basic research can get done and then, like, as you say, picked up by a venture capital firm, and then they market it, get a little traction, and all of a sudden, you know, big pharma buys them up and then they own everything. That's right.
Yeah, it's I don't know. Don't get me started on this, because otherwise I'll have to go take a vacation for like the rest of my life. But it is one of those things that it sort of hurts heart a little bit when you see how it's all made. But I think it is true in many ways that U.S. research and development helps underwrite the cost of this for the entire world. And I think we probably don't get enough credit for that.
I think that's right. And then we can talk about pharmacy benefit manufacturers and have a whole show.
Yeah,
and
you know,
rant
we
about- yeah.
could.
Yeah.
It's a long rant.
I have one more question from Ruth Ellen. This is a great one as well. Ruth wants to know, what about expired COVID test kits? She says, I stocked up on those and now I'm not using them as much. Do those expire?
I think they go to the trash. What do you think?
I agree.
You got to throw them in the trash?
Yeah, I mean, they may not be reliable. So then the question is, if you have a test kit that is expired and say it's 90% chance going to give you the right answer, but you don't know, does that have any value really? And and those test kits at home, they are very specifically designed. The chemical reaction that happens when you do those test kits is pretty sensitive. That's not something, like your Naproxen's different.
Yeah.
But on this, I wouldn't keep. I would let it go.
No, I'm 100%. And even the test strip paper has thing and get too moist, it can get a little old, and then it doesn't respond correct. I mean, there's just so many things that can go wrong that if it's a positive test, it's a positive test. That you can believe. But if it's a negative test, I don't think you know what to mean.
Right.
Yeah.
So you got to throw those out.
Great questions.
It is great. These are great questions today. Thank you to our audience for listening. That is outstanding. Y'all did good today. Great discussion. Rick, final thoughts.
Yeah, I just want a couple things that were going through my mind as we're talking about drug shortages. I want to give a shout out, and Dr. Holzberlein, when he's here, said it, to the folks who work particularly in the pharmacy supply chain here. Our pharmacy supply chain team is outstanding. They do a great job. And interestingly, they're now using a tool with predictive analytics to predict when shortages might happen that help us avoid issues and make sure we have drugs for our patients. But it's an ongoing issue. I'm just happy to be here again. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. You know what? I really appreciate these outstanding questions we're getting today. Yeah. The great engagement by folks. These are really important topics, and I think something we ought to return to sometime in the not so distant future. Here's what I know. The best way to take care of yourself is take care of yourself. And whether that's making sure you don't have expired drugs in your cabinet, making sure you're following the directions on the prescriptions, whether you're trying to be compliant with the medications, exercise, sleep, eating right, take care of yourself. Because in the long run, you will do a better job of taking care of yourself than anybody else. Thanks to everybody for being with us today. It's been a great discussion. We'll be back again tomorrow. And remember, faith, hope, science. Wow, that's a powerful combination. Live long and prosper.
Coming up Friday on the Morning Medical Update. Household cleaners, medications, even art supplies. Chances are there's poison in your home. I'm Jessica Lovell on the next Morning Medical Update. Summer means kids spend more time at home. Poison control experts teach the hidden dangers and best practices to keep your kids safe. Friday at 8.
Subscribe to our Morning Medical Update and Open Mics with Dr. Stites podcast. Now everywhere podcasts are available.